The Knowledgeable Provider podcast is intended primarily to entertain, also to inform, but it is not a substitute for actual medical training and should not be used by anyone to diagnose or treat any medical condition in themselves or others. If you need medical advice, please make an appointment to see your own knowledgeable medical provider. The opinions expressed by me and anyone else who happens to appear on the podcast are solely those of the people expressing them and are not necessarily representative of any other entities. Other than the lunches at the office, I do not receive any sort of compensation from pharmaceutical or medical device companies, and I have no other relevant financial disclosures. Look, this is all for fun, okay? Don't sue me. All right, on with the show. Hey, welcome back to Knowledgeable Provider. I'm your host, Jody Marks. I want to talk about something today that's not strictly medical, can apply to a lot of different disciplines, but it's certainly an important part of medical training as well as any kind of academic program, and that's test-taking strategy. I hate so much seeing students who I know are capable and good medical professionals struggle with a program or even fail out of a program, and it bothers me a lot that we don't have a better way of assessing people or allowing people to succeed in a program, because not everyone's good at test taking. One of the people who went through my nursing program was a paramedic that I knew and had worked with, and I would absolutely trust this person with my life. This person was one of the most capable paramedics that I was ever around, just a fantastic person, a medical professional, went through the entire program with me, and then didn't pass the NCLEX. And as far as I know, never passed the NCLEX, never got the RN license. And that just absolutely breaks my heart. Like, that's the perfect example of somebody who is excellent, would be an excellent nurse, but apparently just struggles with test taking. So like it or not, for better or for worse, that's kind of the way the academic system is set up. It selects for people who are good at taking tests. And fortunately for me, I happen to be one of those people. If you know me, or even if you've just been listening to this podcast for a while, you know I'm not really that smart, but I did great in school. So what's the secret? I am good at taking multiple choice tests. You know, I used to think that I was a genius, but now I know that that's not true. Looking back and thinking about it now, I realize, hey, you're just good at tests. You're just good at this particular style of assessment. Doesn't really say anything about your intelligence, but for whatever reason, I'm just wired to do well in those situations. So I want to talk about that specifically today. I want to talk about some test-taking strategy. I think if students put more time into considering the testing itself and hacks or methods to actually improve their test-taking ability, I think they would do better. I see all these nursing students that I work with just struggling to get by, just barely scraping by, when I know that they are smart and capable, and when I talk to them in class, they know the information. We have good conversations and discussions during my lectures, and I know they know what they're talking about. I know they get it, but then they turn around and don't do well on the exams. And even in situations where I'm standing there in front of them telling them the answer to the exam, when we do instructor-generated exams, it's not always the case that I know in advance what's on the exam, but sometimes I do. And instructors will talk about, I'm not going to teach the test. I'm not going to resort to that. Well, I'll straight up tell you, I have resorted to that at times. Sometimes I'm like, okay, here's what the exam's going to be, so I'm going to make sure the answer to every single question is in my lecture. So all they have to do is listen to me, and I'm telling them the answers to the test. And you know what? They still don't do well. It's certainly possible that I'm not a good teacher. As you know, I'm not a real teacher. I just sort of dabble in that. 100% that could be the problem, but it's very hard for me to understand how I can stand in front of a group of people, spoon feed them the information that they need to know for the exam, and they still don't get it. So that leads me to believe that there's got to be some disconnect between the information that's in their brain and being able to pull that back out and use it on the exam. So here we go. Here are my thoughts about studying and school in general, and then the art of test taking, I guess we can call it. Just based on my own personal experiences, both as a student and as an instructor. There's certainly nothing scientific about this. It's not based on any sort of research or anything other than just my experience over the years. So let's talk about some basic things before we actually get into test-taking strategy. First, before you ever even start a program or get into some kind of educational program, you have to be realistic about your chances of success. I work with quote-unquote non-traditional students, so these are people who are already licensed LPNs and paramedics who are going back to get their RN license, and for the most part, they're people who are already established. They're already working full-time, they have families. Many of them are older than I am, So it's not like working with full-time students in their teens and 20s. I was working full-time when I went through that program. And even for me, as somebody who at the time was single, had no children, had really no obligations other than making my mortgage payment, it was a struggle. It was really hard to fit in my work hours and my clinical hours and the time I needed to study. In fact, for the last semester, I actually cut back to part-time. I lost my health insurance for a time, ran up a ton of credit card debt just to get through that program. So I can only imagine what it must be like for people who are raising children or taking care of their elderly parents or working multiple jobs or just barely scraping by in life. So I think before you jump into something, it's important to be realistic, take a look at your situation, and just ask yourself, is this a good time to do this? Am I going to be able to get through this? Because if you're already just barely getting by from day to day, something's going to have to give if you're going to throw a big educational program on top of that. And if it's not a good time, then that's okay. It's okay to wait till things get better or until you're able to change or improve your circumstances a bit, then do it when it's a better time. Because you'd definitely rather wait than to jump into something and then end up failing and wasting all that time and money. And another thing to be realistic about is your past academic performance. If you're someone who's always struggled with school, if you've never done well in school ever before, I think you should ask yourself, what's going to be different this time? What reason do I have to believe that I'm going to make it through this program if I've failed multiple things in the past? Sometimes when I'm doing advising, I get to see the students' transcripts from their previous educational endeavors. And I don't mean this as a knock on any individual student, but sometimes when you flip back through, you're like, I'm not sure how you got into this program, and I don't really understand why you think you're going to be able to be successful in this when your transcript is like years and years and years of F, 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 F. Again, obviously we want everybody to succeed, but I think if you have struggled in the past, you really got to be honest with yourself and ask yourself what you can do seriously to make sure that that's not going to happen again. Okay, so there's the unpleasant, tough love advice. So now we're in the program, we have exams come up. How do we do well on these exams? Here's my take. Number one, you have to know the information. There's nothing super strategic or life hacky about that advice. Test taking strategy will only take you so far if you don't know anything about the information you're being tested on. So you have to figure out how to study efficiently in a way that works for you. For me personally, study groups are a no-go for me. I do not do well in a group setting. I found that I tend to substitute, our group knows the answer to this question for I know the answer to this question. Like if somebody in the group knows what we're talking about, then I sort of equate that with me knowing what I'm talking about, and that's not always the case. So I found that I really need to study alone. It helps me to put on music, but only instrumental music. If I have music with words, I focus on that and not what I'm supposed to be learning. So that's what works for me. And if I get invited to study groups or whatever, I just have to say no, because I know that's not going to be the best option for me. So your challenge as a learner is to figure out what works for you and make sure you do that and don't get roped into doing a bunch of stuff that is not going to help you. I think I learn a lot by listening. So I think that makes me an auditory learner. And maybe that's why I love podcasts so much and why I get so much out of listening to medical podcasts. So as a student, my MO is typically to go to lecture, listen, take notes, and then study the notes that I took in lecture. Looking back, I wish that I had used the textbooks more. There's no telling how many thousands of dollars I spent on textbooks over the years that I've never even opened. It wasn't until graduate school that somebody gave me a method of using a textbook that made it more practical for me. And I think I can post that for you. That was written by an instructor at the University of South Alabama. So I'll post it with the instructor's name credited on there. I don't think it's any kind of copyrighted thing, hopefully. But basically, I didn't know that you weren't supposed to read textbooks cover to cover. And it just seemed like such a daunting task that I'd almost never even use them. But there's a lot of information in there, and they are very useful. And I think if I had incorporated more of that, maybe I would have been even a little bit more successful. Another thing I see with people studying is they kind of get lost in methodology or materials. There are people that love to use highlighters, right? They have this color-coded system of blue highlights mean this, and red highlights mean this, and yellow mean this. Or they'll take a calendar and divide everything up and plan out what they're going to do. And all that's fine if it helps you, but sometimes I think people concentrate more on their system and sort of like forget to actually learn the information at some point. So use whatever method works for you, but don't get so lost in the details of how your method works that you forget to actually put the information into your brain at some point. I mentioned textbooks, and sometimes I see students kind of getting overwhelmed with all the resources they have. In our program, we throw a ton of resources at students. There's all these different programs they have to use, and they have all these different books and materials available to them. This year we spent, I want to say like 6 hours just going over all the different things that they had to log into and use and buy at the beginning of the year. And it's a lot. I know it's a lot. And there's no way that one person can use all of that stuff effectively, in my opinion. So, whatever resources you do have available to you, take the time at the beginning of the class to look through everything, figure out what's going to work for you, and then just concentrate on that. In our program, they get a lot of redundant sources. So, they have several different textbooks that cover the same information. They have several different options for quizzing and testing and kind of alternative presentations of the material. But at the end of the day, it's all the same material. So, find the source that works for you, stick with that, and tune out the rest of it. With textbooks, I'm of the opinion that the whole textbook thing is a big old racket. A lot of times the school will say, make sure you have the, ninth edition. You can't have any previous edition of the textbook. And in my experience, I've found that sometimes you pay the however many hundreds of dollars for this new edition of the textbook just to use it for one assignment, or just because there's one particular thing in it that the instructor wants you to use for the entire semester. And I know I've wasted a ton of money on textbooks over the years. I think it's fine to look at the older editions of the textbook and just see if they're pretty much the same, because you can get, the previous edition of a textbook for like pennies on the dollar compared to buying the newest version. And many times it's pretty much the same thing. So be open to that. And another thing I see students doing that kind of baffles me sometimes is they have all this stuff at their disposal. They have all these things and books and resources that they've paid hundreds of dollars to have access to, and they'll run around going, somebody tell me something that I can use to study. They want to go buy something else, some review program or something that's completely not offered by the school at all. And I'm always like, why don't you use what you have? Why pay even more money than you already have just for a different presentation of the same material? So I think it's one thing if you find somebody on YouTube, or if you find a particular review book that like just absolutely clicks with you and you do great with it and it makes everything make sense. Okay, maybe it's worth it, but give the stuff that you've already paid for a chance before you go completely outside of the program looking for some other magic resource. And the last thing I'll say about studying, above all else, if what you're doing is not working, you have to try something else. The old thing about the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. If you're bombing every test, you have got to try something different. Don't just keep doing the same thing. We've implemented this system of self-analysis where they have several forms that they have to fill out and think through after the test, with the goal of just kind of pinpointing, okay, what went wrong here and what can I do differently next time? If you're struggling and you're not evaluating what you're doing and you're not trying some different way of doing things, you're going to continue to struggle. Okay, number 2, take care of yourself. Being in school is so stressful, and then trying to pack that in with whatever else is going on in your life just makes it incredibly stressful. It's always amazing to me to watch the students that I work with. I'm with each group for 1 year, for 3 semesters. And it's so profound how much their general demeanor and attitude kind of changes over the program. At the outset, they're all bright-eyed and excited and happy. And by the end of the year, they're like these snarling, beasts that are like, leave me alone. Because it is very hard. It's just hard and it sucks. And it involves a lot of sacrifice. So you have to make sure that you're taking care of your basic needs. If you think back to this from your education, or if you've heard this before, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the idea is that you kind of have to have the basic stuff taken care of before you can do anything more advanced. And I think learning and performing well in an academic setting is going to be on toward the top of that pyramid. If your basic physiological and emotional needs are not met, there's no way you can use your brain to its fullest potential and learn as well as you should. So make sure that you're eating well, get some exercise, make sure you're getting enough sleep. Especially the night before the test. Don't stay up cramming all night. Get 8 hours of sleep. That'll do you way more good than anything you might be able to cram into your brain at the last second after being awake for 16 hours or whatever. I remember one student in particular, and maybe I've already mentioned this on the podcast, I can't remember, but she struggled a lot during the program, and English was not her first language. And she kept saying that the language barrier was what was making her struggle with the exams. And I tried everything I could think of to mitigate that for her, but it turned out that apparently nobody really cared, and I didn't have any options for her, and she ended up failing. Came back the next year and killed it, just knocked it all out of the park. One of the top students blazed through it and did well and finished the program. And when I talked to her about it, what she told me was, yeah, I just wasn't sleeping last time. That's pretty much why I was not doing well. So you have to take care of those basic things. And then pay attention to your mental health. That's a huge one for me. That really caught up to me at one point. And I've been going back and forth about whether I should share all that on the podcast. But at some point, maybe I'll tell you that whole story. But it eventually did catch up with me because I had ignored my issues with primarily depression for really my whole life. And then it ended up really having a profound effect on me. So I think everybody ought to go to counseling. I think that ought to just be something we all do, just like we go in and get our blood pressure and glucose and cholesterol checked every now and then. I think we should all just go in for routine brain checkups. And that's what I do. I'm on about a 3-month schedule. I just see my counselor every 3 months just to check in, make sure we're good, talk about whatever we need to talk about. It is so beneficial, y'all. It is so fantastic to just spend an hour talking through whatever's on your mind with somebody who is impartial and who is trained to help you think about things in a productive way, or work on whatever issues are bothering you. Go to counseling, please. And medication can also be helpful. There are a ton of options out there for medications for depression or anxiety, or if you have issues even with psychosis of some type, bipolar, schizophrenia, the kind of big league psychiatric disorders. There are medicines available. Go ask for medication if you feel like you need it, or at least go talk to a healthcare provider about that. And we know that therapy and medication are synergistic. The whole's greater than the sum of the parts, right? The two things together work incredibly well for dealing with those issues. So don't ignore that. If you're not in good working order, you're not going to be able to do well in any kind of program. Which leads me to number 3, manage anxiety. I see students freaking out about these exams. And if I had to pinpoint one single reason why many students don't do well on exams, I bet it's anxiety. I bet they are so freaking out and there's so much riding on them getting a good grade that they just psych themselves up into the state where it's just impossible to think rationally. If you only take one thing away from this podcast episode, this is probably the one to take away. Get a hold of the anxiety. One thing that the instructor in charge of our program this year started doing that I really like is before every exam, she will play a video or an audio track of just some guided meditation, as in, close your eyes, take deep breaths, feel your feet on the floor. Just a little 2-3 minute routine that the students can just go through to give them a minute to just calm down before we start the exam. But even with that, just sitting there watching the students take the test, you can see how nervous they are. They're all like locked in on their screens, and some of them, they have this tense body language, or some of them are doing the, vibrating leg thing where they're sitting there literally bouncing up and down, vibrating in their seat. You can tell how freaking nervous they are. I sort of wish I could just spray the whole room with Xanax or something and just make everybody chill out, because I know the grades would go up if they were all a bit more relaxed. I remember when I was taking my NCLEX exam, it was at a big multi-story building over in Decatur. So I was up on the, 4th, 5th floor or something. And on that day, there happened to be a street festival going on outside. There was a band playing. There's like a jazz band playing. And it was quiet in the room, but you could clearly hear that. And I would assume some people there testing probably didn't like that, but I dug it. Listening to that music and kind of focusing on that music a little bit while I was taking that test just kept me so relaxed. And I had a good time taking that test. I was enjoying the music, enjoying myself. I was very relaxed. So I think anything you can do to help yourself calm down prior to and during a test is very, very helpful. So address that as much as you can prior to the exam, but then during the exam too, just stop, take a minute, close your eyes, take some deep breaths, go to your happy place, release all the tension in your muscles. It's going to help you do better. 2 big things that help me avoid anxiety about a test. The first one, again, is just knowing the information. I know going into an exam whether I'm prepared or not. And if I know that I have studied my butt off and I know the information cold, I'm way less anxious about the test than if I'm just trying to wing it, or if I know I haven't spent enough time preparing. And the other thing is just to approach the test with a good attitude. If you walk into that test going, oh, this test is going to kick my butt, it's going to make me fail the semester, oh, I'm not going to do well, that's really not helpful. Pump yourself up before you go in for that exam. Go into that test knowing that you can be successful, that you are going to be successful regardless of any other circumstances. Just having that positive attitude will go a long way in helping your brain to relax and come up with the right answers when you need it to. Okay, 4th big point. I don't know how people feel about tests, and I'm primarily talking about multiple choice tests here. Obviously, there are other types of tests and questions, and I'll address that in a little bit. But I think multiple choice tests are fantastic, and let me tell you why. With a multiple choice question, you don't have to know the answer to the question. The answer's right there in front of you in one of the choices. So all you have to do is know just enough to pick the right answer, to recognize the right answer. So in my mind, you're already starting with an advantage. And now as an instructor, another thing I know about these tests is that they are designed for you to be successful. We don't want anyone to fail. We want everyone to be successful. And when we're putting these tests together, they can't be so easy that everybody makes 100. You don't want to go through a program like that. But also, they can't be so hard that nobody's going to do well. There are actually little metrics that the nursing department uses, and I don't know enough about them to be able to explain them, but the testing program we use analyzes each test, and it spits out these numbers that basically say, how did the class in general do? And we shoot for a kind of a range on those numbers that basically just tell us this test was hard enough, but not too hard. So, of course, I can only speak for myself here. I know not every instructor feels the same way. But for me personally, I only put questions on an exam that either I have explicitly given the answers to in my lectures or that I feel like the student should be able to figure out based on the information that I have given. Sometimes, like I said before, I already know what's going to be on the test while I'm giving the lecture. If that's not the case, when I do go back to make the exam questions, I always just take from the things that I've said, the things that were covered in my lecture. I try to make it as easy as I possibly can. Sometimes I even feel like I'm totally selling out and not being a good teacher because I've been so explicit about what they need to know. Somehow it never matters. Somehow everyone still struggles. But I promise I am not trying to trick you. And I know that a lot of effort goes into making the standardized tests. If you're not taking a test that your instructor has generated, they have big committees of people that review every single question and every single answer choice and make sure that it's fair and valid and correct. So in general, nobody's trying to trick you with these tests. They are designed for you to be able to at least pass. If there's one instructor or a group of instructors making your test, it's a good idea to think about that and kind of know who they are. There was one instructor when I went through the nursing program who's no longer there, but that person 100% wanted to trip students up and give very hard questions and make people get the wrong answers. And so you just had to know that going into the test that instructor made. Like, you got to keep your eye out. There's going to be some hard questions or maybe some tricky ones in here. And it's probably fair to say that every instructor has their own, maybe you call them pet peeves, things that they really think are important that they really hammer. And so it's important to pay attention to what those things are if that person's making your test, because you know that's going to show up on the exam. But all that being said, there are definitely bad questions, especially if it's an instructor-generated exam. If you have somebody like me making questions, which I learned really quickly that it's very hard to make a decent exam question, so I pretty much only use questions that other people have made. But whether you're talking about a locally generated test or a standardized test, I definitely see questions on there that I'm like, okay, this question sucks. This is a bad question. It doesn't make sense. The answer's not right. And sometimes that's a personal opinion that is very subjective. Sometimes they're just objectively wrong. And I go, okay, that's not a good question. We're not using that. So if you're taking an exam and you run across a question that doesn't seem fair or that you believe is wrong, there's really nothing you can do about it in the moment. You just have to do the best you can, answer it, move on, but then speak up about it after the exam. Make sure the instructors know your concerns. Because if you struggled with it and had those thoughts about it, chances are that other people in the class probably did too. And I think that you should do everything you can do as a student to get credit where credit is due. The squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? I'm definitely not a confrontational person. And later on in my academic career, I quit being the person that spoke up about anything. But when I was in paramedic school, I was obnoxious about arguing about exam questions, and I was already doing great. But it just pissed me off when I missed a question that I completely disagreed with, that I just thought was a bad question and was wrong. And my other thought was, if I could argue about a question and get the instructors to give credit back, that's helping everybody else in the class too, not just me. So I was totally that person. And I don't know how the other students felt about that, but it does work. And as an instructor, looking at it now from that side, it is obnoxious when students argue about the questions and get mad. But, I'm not the one who has anything riding on it at this point. If you've got a lot invested in a program and you're trying to change your life and better yourself, and everything rides on making it through this program or even making a good grade on this one exam, damn right, speak up, raise your concerns. Because also as an instructor, probably 85-90% of the time when a student raises a concern about a question, I agree with them, or I can at least understand why they would think that way or feel that way. And I want to give points back. If there's some reason that I can throw out a question or give credit back, heck yeah, that's exactly what I want to do. In our program, we go immediately after the exam, just the instructors, and go back and look at every question that less than 75% of the class got right. And a lot of times we don't give back credit. If it's something that I stood in front of the class and explicitly said, or if it's something that just seems so simple and easy, we're not necessarily going to give credit back. But once in a while, we will find questions that are like, oh, okay, well, I can see why they would pick that. Or a student has said something to me and I can explain, okay, well, this student told me that they picked this answer because of whatever their reasoning was. And a lot of times we will give credit back if there's any way we reasonably can. So if you find a bad question, if you don't agree with something, speak up after the test. The worst they can do is not do anything. It doesn't hurt you and it may help you get some points back. So those are my big general tips. Now let's talk about some more practical tips for multiple choice tests specifically. Each question is a chance for you to pick the right answer. So for each question, you want to approach it calmly, knowing that you know enough information to be able to choose the right answer. Have a good attitude with each question. Even if you struggled with the previous question, the next question is like a whole new ballgame, whole new day. And remember, the answer is right there in front of you. You don't have to know it really. If you read the question and don't know the answer immediately, it's okay. Don't panic. It's right there. It's still right there in front of you. You just have to figure it out. And if you're prepared enough, you should know enough information to figure out the right answer, even if you don't immediately know it off the top of your head. And remember that on a multiple choice test, recognizing the wrong answers is every bit as valuable as knowing the right answer. So you read the question, you don't know what the answer is, but then you read through the answer choices and you go, well, that's obviously wrong. That's obviously wrong. That's obviously wrong. So I guess this other one must be the right answer. I'm really not much of a numbers guy, but in this situation, the percentages and probabilities and all that involved in multiple choice questions are very reassuring and comforting to me. So assuming that you have 4 answer choices and only one of those answers is correct, that means that right off the bat, you have a 25% chance of getting the answer right. If you just guess the answer to a question and immediately move on, there's a 25% chance you pick the right answer. If you can eliminate just one answer choice, well, now you have a 33% chance of picking the right answer. You've improved your odds significantly right there. And if you can eliminate it down to 2 choices, well, now it's 50-50. You have a 50% chance of getting the right answer. So anything you can do is useful. So if you read a question and you read the answer choices and you have only one little idea about one little answer choice of whether it's right or wrong, if you can eliminate one answer choice, you have already made progress toward getting the right answer to that question. So there's always reason for hope. With the questions themselves, make sure you read the question very carefully. A lot of times we're anxious, we're trying to move quickly, and a very common mistake is to read the question so fast that you don't really get the point of it, or you don't understand what it's actually asking you. And one little word in that stem of the question can change the whole meaning of a question. So you have to slow down enough and calm down enough that you have time for your brain to process the whole question and make sure that you know what the question is actually asking you before you jump to conclusions. A lot of times you're going to find distracting information in the question that doesn't have anything to do with the answer at all. With our nursing tests, especially the questions that involve any kind of numbers or math, almost all the time there's going to be some number in there that makes no difference at all. Let's say it's a question where you have to do a drug calculation and the question has the patient's age and the time that you came in for your shift and the patient's weight, even if it's not a weight-based calculation. And all that's really just sort of thrown in there to distract you. So it's very helpful if you can read through the question and go, okay, this number doesn't mean anything. I don't need this number for the answer. I came up with a math question that I thought was pretty clever, and it's a drug calculation question. I think it was maybe about giving a bolus dose of something during a code. And so I put a picture of the box that contains the pre-filled syringe on the exam. And I put all this information in the stem about here's the vital signs and here's the rhythm and here's the blah, 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 blah. All this stuff in there. And what the question is actually asking is how many boxes of this pre-filled syringe do I have to open to be able to give the correct dose? And I'll admit that is designed to be a little tricky in the sense that it requires you to read the whole question and figure out what you're being asked. Because the temptation probably is just to go, oh, this is a drug calculation. Let me figure out what the dose is going to be, blah, 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 and not read through the whole question and realize that you're not being asked for milliliters or milligrams like you typically would be. You're being asked the number of boxes or the number of containers you need. So that's a great example of why it's important to read the question carefully and figure out what you're being asked before you start trying to figure out the answer. I'm a fan of reading the question first, considering it, and then looking at the answer choices. But the other way to look at that is you can read the answer choices first before you read the question. My preference is to read the question first and just see if I already know the answer. And then if I find that answer in the answer choices, I can just pick it and move on and not have to spend any more time with it. But if you read the answer choices first, that will at least kind of put you in the right frame of mind to understand what you're being asked. Because if you know what your choices are, when you read through the question, that'll help you throw out the information that doesn't make any difference. Because you're like, my mind might go this way based on this statement, but that wouldn't be an answer choice. So probably a distractor. And keep in mind that the way you read the question, the way you interpreted the question might be wrong. If you read the stem to the question and now you're looking at the answers and none of them make any sense to you, it's possible that you didn't understand what the question was asking. Or if it seems like you're not being given enough information, you definitely run into questions and you think, well, there's no way I can answer this question without knowing this other piece of information. And you may be right. That may be a bad question, but it also may be that you are just kind of thinking about the whole thing in the wrong way. And I see students do that a lot. They'll come in hot, mad as a hornet after the exam. This question, ba, 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 ba. And then when you actually look back at the question with them, many, many times they'll go, oh, I didn't understand that's what it was asking, or I didn't read the question right, or I didn't think about it in that way. So if something's not adding up, take the time to stop and open your mind and reconsider the whole premise of whatever you're thinking about. When you're looking at the answer choices, look for any kind of patterns. Sometimes it'll be the case that like 2 or 3 of the 4 answer choices are kind of all basically the same thing, and then there's one that's different. And that's a huge clue. On a test we had recently, there was a question that came from my content about congenital heart defects, and the issue was patent ductus arteriosus. And with those, sometimes you want them to close and sometimes you want them to stay open. If you want them to stay open, you give the patient prostaglandin. If you want it to close, you give the patient an NSAID. And I don't remember how the question was phrased, but looking at the answer choices, there were 3 medication names that were all NSAIDs, and there was one that was not an NSAID. And a lot of people missed it. It was one of the questions that we had to review because not very many people got it right. And I thought, even if you didn't know anything about congenital heart defects, even if you didn't pay attention to my lecture at all, you should be able to look at these choices and go, okay, one of these 4 things is not like the other 3. So I'm going to assume that's probably the answer. Another thing that sometimes shows up in answer choices is opposites. If you notice that 2 answer choices are complete opposites of each other, like both of those things could not be true at the same time, chances are one of those is going to be the right answer. So even if you don't know which one it is, if you throw out the other 2 answer choices, now you're at 50-50. Now you have a much better chance if you have to guess. I mentioned distractors a couple of times. Sometimes in the answer choices, there will be things just thrown in there completely out of left field. And at least in my experience, when I'm making exam questions, sometimes I just need a 3rd or a 4th answer choice to throw in there. And I don't want to pick anything that might possibly be the right answer. So I'll just grab something completely unrelated and throw it in there. And I think a lot of times these tend to be terms that maybe we know the students wouldn't recognize or wouldn't be familiar with. So don't fall for that. If you're looking at the answer choices and there's just something on there that you literally have never heard of, that you have no idea what it means, don't fall into the trap of picking that as the answer. I think it's probably human nature to assume, oh, I don't know what that means. That must mean that I didn't study this well or I wasn't prepared. So I'm going to pick that one because that's probably the right answer. But that's 100% not the case. If it's something you've never heard of, then it's probably just in there to distract you and you can pretty much immediately eliminate it. If you have any clue about the other answer choices, do not pick the one that you've never heard of before. Unless you are 100% sure that all the other choices are definitely wrong. That's the only situation where you would want to pick that 4th choice that you've never heard of before. Remember that you can use the test itself. With the exam software we're using now, students do not have the option to go back and look at previous questions once they've answered them. But in other situations, you may have the option to click back to other test questions. And sometimes it will be that you'll be rocking along doing the test and you'll get a question that is somehow related to a previous question. And either it'll jog your memory about whatever the subject of the question is, or it'll flat out tell you the answer to a previous question in the stem of the question you're on now. So if that happens, if you can go back, if the test makes it obvious to you that an answer you put before was wrong, use that information, go back and change your answer. And I'm real hesitant about encouraging you to change any answers because, in general, you should never change your answers. We know that the first answer you choose is way more likely to be the right answer than whatever you might change it to later. So once you choose an answer, that's the time to stop thinking about it, move on to the next question. Because if you talk yourself into changing that answer, you're probably changing it to the wrong answer. If there's some reason that you are 100% sure that your choice is wrong, maybe you go back and read the question again and realize you didn't understand what it was asking, or if something new pops into your head and you are 100% sure that another choice is right, then change it. But otherwise, in any other circumstance, do not change your answer. I think this is probably the second thing after anxiety that causes students to mess up tests is overthinking, not trusting themselves, reading information into the question that is not there. In medicine, like everything is subjective. It's very, very hard to pick a question about a medical topic where a person could not possibly say, well, what if this? Well, what about in this situation? You would do something different. And that's always true. So when you read a question, you have to fight the urge to assume things or add things to the questions that are not there. You have to go only on the information you're given. And it's very easy to talk yourself out of a simple answer also. It's easy to go, well, that can't be the answer. That's way too obvious. If you think that's the answer, choose it and move on. Don't talk yourself out of the one you already picked. And that's something that you can practice. When you're doing practice tests to prepare for an exam, I tell students all the time, practice, make yourself choose an answer and move on. Choose an answer and move on. Don't overthink it. And I bet you're going to see your scores go up if that's an issue for you. You have to be mindful of time on an exam. I would say that most exams are time limited, and you should have plenty of time, but it's good to just have an idea in your head about how much time you have total and how much time you should be spending on each question, or at least how much time you have left. If you're the last person in the room and the clock's ticking down, it's good to be aware of, hey, I have time to finish this, or hey, I need to start guessing so that I don't leave any of these questions blank. So that is something you have to pay attention to. I'm not really a fan of timed exams. I wish that people had all the time they wanted, but most of the time that's just not practical. So it's very important not to get bogged down. We've already talked about just picking an answer and moving it. Like once you've chosen an answer, you don't need to spend any more time on the question. Move on. If you're really stuck on a question, if you've spent a ton of time staring at this question and you cannot figure the answer out and you're just hopeless about it, you have to just guess and move on. You can't spend all day and use all your time for that one question because it's going to cause you to miss other questions that you would have gotten right if you run out of time. If you have the option to skip a question and come back, that's excellent. That's fine. I would say go ahead and choose an answer. Don't just leave it blank and then come back, because if you do end up running out of time, at least there will be some chance that you chose the right answer instead of just leaving it blank. There's a 100% chance that you did not choose the right answer if you didn't choose an answer at all. We know that not every exam is all multiple choice, so you have to know in advance if that's going to be the case, and you should know really about every exam what type of questions are going to be on the exam. On our nursing test, and this is like the bane of every nursing student's existence, I'm sure, is the type of question where it says select all that apply, meaning more than one answer might be right. And that's a lot more challenging because then you can't lean on the knowledge that only one of these choices is correct. So in those situations, you have to know a little bit more about the information that you're trying to answer the question about. I think on those questions, you probably want to err on the side of choosing more answers rather than less. I think it's pretty rare that you're going to get a question with multiple correct answers that it's either going to be all or none. Like if you don't get all the answers, you're not going to get any credit. I think on most of those questions, you're probably going to get partial credit for choosing some of the right answers. So I would say you want to err more on the side. If you're not sure if an answer is right or wrong on one of those select all that apply questions, you probably want to go ahead and choose it. Other types of questions, of course, there's true false questions, which there you have a 50-50 chance right off the bat. But you have to be real careful about how the question's worded, because often those will be kind of tricky. They'll throw one word in there that makes it true or false. And if you're not paying attention, it's easy to pick the wrong choice. If you're doing a test where you have to answer essay questions or fill in the blank questions, that's the real test. That's when you know if you know the answer or not. I remember my ecology class in college. We only had essay questions for our exams. And you just flat out had to know the answer to the question. You had to know the information. Our professor was a pretty interesting guy, and he always did this thing where if he thought you were just randomly writing stuff, he would draw a little picture of a bull next to your answer, as in bullshit. To me, that's probably the most intimidating form of any kind of exam, other than being questioned by another person, having some kind of oral exam. Because with essay or fill in the blank, you either know the answer or you don't. And thankfully, there's not a lot of those because, of course, they're harder to grade. That means somebody has to read the essays or read the answer choices and grade it rather than just having the computer grade it. And actually, even fill in the blanks can be graded by the computer. We have some questions like that on ours. Sometimes you'll get those matching questions where you have a column of one thing on the left and another thing on the right, and you have to connect the two. And that can be kind of helpful as far as ruling out right or wrong answers. If you connect the ones that you're absolutely sure about, then that kind of whittles it down so that you have fewer choices for the ones you're not sure about. And then with computer testing, you have a lot of different options for like drag and drop things or looking at images or looking at a whole, in our case, patient care record and having to answer questions out of that. So there are a lot of different types of questions that you may be presented with. Again, just make sure you read the question and understand what you're being asked. A lot of our students struggle with math, and one thing that comes up there frequently is rounding. We go over general rules for rounding, so we set parameters as far as this is what we expect you to do. If you get this kind of question, you're going to round it to this decimal place, whatever. And more often than not, the question itself will say, round the answer to the nearest tenth or round to the nearest whole number or whatever. But we still see a lot of rounding errors. So that's an easy way to lose credit on a question that you would have otherwise gotten right. So just pay attention and make sure you know what you're being asked. If you're allowed to ask questions during an exam, do it. As an instructor, it drives me crazy when the students raise their hand during an exam and I walk up to them and they want me to answer the question for them, or they want to argue with me about the question in the middle of the test. But as a student, you should 100% do that, because I try to be very conscientious about not just telling the students the answers to the test in the middle of the test. I mean, I'm not going to help you cheat. But if I think it's fair, I will sometimes help a student clarify a term or help them understand what the question is asking. So as a student taking a test, you want to put that burden on the instructor, because hopefully you don't have instructors that would just come answer the question for you, but maybe you do have a soft touch like me who would help clarify something or help you understand something. And if that's the difference between you missing that question or getting it right, heck yeah, raise your hand and get somebody to come over. Don't be surprised if they just look at you and go, yeah, I'm not answering that for you. Because I will do that too. If somebody's just blatantly asking for the key to answering the question, I will actually say, yeah, no, I can't tell you that, or I'm not going to tell you that. So be ready for the no. But if there's any chance you can get some information that's helpful, take that chance. So those are all my specific little tips, tricks, and hacks for test taking. A few final thoughts. Just like you can study to learn the information, you can practice taking exams. There are all kinds of different resources and things out there where you can create practice tests for yourself. And so when you're doing that, look at that as an opportunity, not just to learn the information, but also to focus on your skills as a test taker. That's a great time when you're not under pressure to actually start thinking about, okay, how can I figure out the right answer to this question, even if I don't know it? Or what caused me to miss this question that wasn't just not knowing the information? How could I have gotten this right? If you approach the whole thing as its own subject area, how to take a test, that is something that you can practice and get better at, along with just learning the information you're covering. If you have a chance to go back and review the exam after it's over, I think it's good to take that opportunity. Our students, after they have submitted their exam, they get a chance to go back and review to see what they missed and see what the rationale for that is, and they kind of get a chance to evaluate their own performance. And sometimes that may be the only chance you get to look back at the exam. I know Calhoun is real strict about test security, so they're not sharing specific test information with people after the test is over. And that's a piece of advice that I definitely don't take a lot. Usually once I finish the test, I just want to get the hell out of there. I want to be done with it and move on. So a lot of times I don't take the opportunity to do that, but that may be the only chance you get. So if you can make yourself sit there for a little bit longer, if you can make your brain absorb any more information, that's your chance to figure out what you did wrong, and it should help you if you ever see that information again. Before you finish the exam, if you do have time to go back and review it, you should probably do that. I'm usually a pretty fast test taker, so I usually finish in plenty of time. And for a long time, I was guilty of just getting up and leaving and not bothering to go back and check my answers. I'm not a big fan of going back and revisiting every single question. I think you have to trust your past self enough that you know that you already put all the thought you can put into a question and you pick the answer that's most likely to be right. What I started doing is just going back and clicking through the test just to make sure that I answered every single question, just to make sure that I didn't leave anything blank. Or to me, with the computer testing, it's easy to kind of accidentally click on something or accidentally change something without meaning to. So that was my strategy, was just to click back through the whole thing, make sure that every question has an answer. And then if there was some incredibly extenuating circumstance that made me want to change an answer, I would think about doing that. So there you go. That's all the secrets of my academic success. I hope that something I've said maybe has been useful for you. If you have anything to add, if you have any thoughts or questions, of course, feel free to reach out. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time. All right, that does it for this episode of Knowledgeable Provider. I'm your host, Jody Marks. Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to like, subscribe, or follow on your preferred listening platform. Give us a nice 5-star rating and leave a nice review. If you'd like to help support the show, you can do that at patreon.com/knowledgeableprovider. And as always, stay safe, take care of yourself, and take care of your patients in that order.